Today we're going to be talking about perfecting your timpani rolls. Timpani rolls are one of the most fundamental things that we do with this instrument. It's used in virtually any piece that I can think of, and it's one of those skills that you really need to refine in order to sound and play your best. So what is a timpani roll consist of? Well, 9 out of 10 times it's going to be a single stroke roll. So in other words, this would be different than, say, a snare drum roll, which is going to be a multiple bounce or a buzz roll. The reason that we use a single stroke roll versus a multiple bounce roll is that if I use that multiple bounce roll, I'm actually striking the head too many times, and I'm actually cutting off the sound. Whereas if I do a single stroke roll, it allows the head to resonate to its fullest potential. So let me do that one more time just to demonstrate the difference. So this will be a buzz roll followed by the single stroke roll. So I hope it was pretty obvious that I'm getting the drums to ring a lot more when I'm doing the single stroke roll. There will be those times, though, for instance, if you are using wood mallets, that some sort of a buzz roll might be preferable. And so that's that 1 out of 10 times that I'm talking about. But in general, working on your single strokes is what you need to do. A few things are going to affect the sound production with your rolls. In general, you want to roll as slow as possible in order to get the drums to ring as much as possible. And so there will be that point where you're rolling too slow, that you do need to speed it up, but you certainly don't need to go as fast as you can. Because again, what you're doing when you're doing that is you're choking off the sound of the drum, as well as adding unnecessary tension. So the general rule, again, roll as slow as possible in order to get that sustained sound. And it might take a little bit of experimentation, having somebody out in the audience, maybe about 30 feet away or so, to kind of help you gauge and dial into what that is. You might hear the individual beats on top of the drum, but I guarantee you with a little bit of a buffer, say 30 feet or so, it starts to bleed together, especially if you're in a resonant hall. The other things that are going to affect the sound of your rolls are the beating spot. So I would advocate that you roll in the normal beating spot, which is about 3 to 4 inches from the bearing edge. If you roll too far into the drum, you get a kind of a tubby, boxy sound. And if you go the other way and you roll too close to the bearing edge, you get a really light, bright sound that has almost no fundamental sound at all. So if you need to roll soft, yeah, that might be an option, but I would advocate that you try and still get a good fundamental sound in the normal beating spot. And perhaps save rolling out towards the bearing edge for a special effect. I think the other thing, hopefully, that you're noticing is that my mallets are a little bit far apart from each other. So they're not right on top of each other like this. What I like to tell my students is that they're about lug to lug. I feel like you get a drier, more direct sound when you're in one beating spot, rather than opening it up and getting more of the head to resonate. So I'll try that again. I'll do a little bit louder. So they don't have to be terribly far apart. Again, I think lug to lug, just inside, is a good place to start. The last thing I will say about getting a good sounding timpani roll is you need to make sure that you're lifting out of the head. So in other words, I'm not playing into the head like this. Again, it doesn't give you a very pleasing sound, right? If I'm thinking about actively lifting out of the head, drums and the mallets really will do the work for me. So that's a super important detail to remember, is that you're lifting out rather than playing into the head to get the drums to sound their best. A couple of other things to note. There are 5 factors that are going to affect the sound of your timpani roll. A few of them have to do with the drums themselves, and a couple are extraneous to that. So let's talk about the ones that are directly related to the drums themselves. The first one is the size of the drum. So as a general statement, all things being equal, I'm going to need to roll faster on the smaller drum, on the 23-inch drum, rather than the 32, where I can get by with a slower roll bass. I'll try some hard mallets so you can really hear this. So hopefully you can hear that on this low 32-inch drum. I can get by with about that speed in order for me to get a good roll. If I tried that same thing on the 23, to my ear it definitely sounds like a rhythm, and I'm going to have to go a little bit faster. So that's number one. Number two is going to be the tension of the drums. So let's say I have the 29 all the way down to the bottom of its range. I can probably get by with about that slow of a roll bass. Whereas all the way up, right? So I'm trying to feel what the head is giving me and always adjusting to that. Okay? Another factor that's going to affect that are the dynamics. And so a general statement is, if I have a loud dynamic, say a forte or fortissimo, I need to roll a little bit faster than I do for a piano dynamic. So this will be forte. Versus piano. Again, forte. And piano. So you can imagine then, if you've got a crescendo, your hands are going to get a little bit faster as you approach that forte. And likewise, the opposite would happen for a decrescendo. A couple of other things that are not related to the drums that are going to affect the sound of your roll. One is going to be, of course, your mallet choice. And so if I have a really articulate mallet, like these pair of wood mallets, I'm going to have to go pretty fast in order to get that roll to sound. Whereas I have a big poofy mallet, something like this David Herbert No. 6, which has a felt core to it. I can get by with a much, much slower roll speed with my hands. Let's do a couple of other options here. This is a David Herbert 5, which has a felt covering with a cork core. This is a JG American Series No. 2. So it's going to be a much harder mallet. It's got a felt core, but it's a tighter felt. And finally, I have a pair of these JG Joe Pereira mallets that are actually flannel, and they're pretty articulate as well. So it just takes a little bit of experimentation to figure out, again, using your ear to judge how much can I pull back, how slow can my hands go, and still get that good roll sound. The last thing that will affect the speed of your roll and the overall sound of your roll is the room acoustic. So I'm in a concert hall by myself right now, and I would say that it's fairly wet, although it dries up pretty quickly. listening to the acoustic. So I would say it's a good general middle of the road sound versus, as you can imagine, playing in a cinder block practice room as some of you are doing at home. And you need to roll probably a lot faster because it's not a very live space versus like a large cathedral where it might ring for days and you can get by with a super slow roll to make things happen. So those are just some of the things to consider. Those are the 5 factors. Again, the size of the drum, the head tension of each drum, the dynamics, the mallet choice, and the acoustics of the room. So this is the next thing I'd like to talk about is a good way to work on your rolls and build up your roll chops. One of my favorite exercises to do this is an 8/8-16 type of exercise. And I'll do it a couple of different ways. I'll do it just as 8th notes, and then we'll do a variation that has 16th notes, which approaches a little bit closer to what the roll actually is. And so if you have a pair of timpani mallets at home, and if you have a timpani practice pad, that's great. If you've got a set of timpani yourself, that's wonderful. They used to make gel pads for mice or for keyboards. That's a great that's a great substitute to use instead of the practice pad as well. Even if you have a pillow, something like that will work well. I wouldn't recommend using a real feel practice pad or anything like that. If you try to use a timpani mallet on a real feel practice pad, it feels awful. So I would, again, recommend if you've got a timpani practice pad or a set of timpani, which is wonderful, you can use the gel pad of a mouse pad or a keyboard pad, or a pillow works just fine. If you happen to be able to go into school and practice, what I would recommend in the practice room is to actually dampen the drums. I recommend that because it allows you to hone in on what that first attack sounds like. And if you can get that to sound really, really even, the rest of it will take care of itself. So if you'd like to practice at home, this exercise is going to be 8 right hands, 8 left hands, and then followed by 16 right hands. And then we reverse it. 8, 8, 16. Couple of things to note here. Since I am really just honing in on the technique here, I like to have my other hand held up there as a guide for how high vertically my sticks are going. It's also a really good visual reminder to lift out of the drums. So rather than, which might lead to a downstroke, doing it this way encourages you to lift and make sure that you're always resetting. So we're going to do this a few different tempos. I'm going to start out at quarter note equals 100. And again, if you've got your timpani mallets and some sort of pad at home to practice on, you can follow along. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, and. As you're going through it, go through your mental checklist. Am I seeing my hands reset to the same stick height? Am I hearing them produce the same sound? And that could either be a stick height issue or could be a beating spot placement on the head issue. Most importantly, am I relaxed when I'm doing this, or am I super tense? And if I am tense somewhere, is it in my shoulders? Is it in my lower back? Determining that. Because again, if you can play relaxed, it'll start to free things up and you're going to get the most consistent sound. All right, let's try this one more time. We're going to try this at quarter note equals 130 now. So a little bit faster. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and. Now I'm going to keep it at 130 here for a second. I'd like to do the 8/8/16 variation where we add 16th notes. And so the difference here is I'm going to play 4 eighth notes and then switch to doing 16th notes. The trick is I'm going to switch my hands. So it'll be right, left, left, right, right, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then left. And then we reverse it. Left, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so let's try it a couple times at that tempo, at that quarter note equals 130. Here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and 2. Okay, so this last time, we're going to do it at quarter note equals 160. For me, 160, 170 is going to be about as fast as you really need to develop your hands. You can certainly go beyond that, but I've found that my hands rarely have to go much faster than quarter note equals 160 or 170 to get a good sounding roll, with the exception of super, super articulate mallets. So we're going to try the 8/8/16, the normal version, and then we'll follow that with the 16th note variations. Okay, 8/8/16, here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and. Okay, now with the 16th note variation, this is going to go a little bit faster. It's going to feel a little bit faster, rather. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, and. Now let's just see what our roll sounds like now. I'll take the mute off so the drum is ringing. Okay, and I'll try even with a different pair of mallets. These are going to be a much softer pair. And so with that one basic exercise, you can really do a lot of good for the fundamental sound of your timpani roll and really refine that. Again, 8/8/16 works really well. You can do it the way I just did it in terms of kind of a mezzo forte to forte dynamic. Practice it soft. Practice it with different head tensions. Practice it on different drums. There's a lot of different ways that you can use that one exercise to really refine your roll. A couple of other considerations here before I do a little bit of playing on some etudes. Forte piano rolls. You're going to be asked to do forte piano rolls quite a bit as a timpanist. I think of like every pops concert I've ever done. Now presenting. So on and so forth, right? It's a pretty bread and butter thing for a timpanist to do. I think there are 3 basic ways that you can do a forte piano roll. Number 1 is to have a loud stroke followed by immediately going soft. And that's a really useful sound if the timpani is exposed at all. So if it was a solo at the beginning and nobody else is playing, or if you need to do it in an actual timpani solo, it's a very, very useful sound. And hopefully you're seeing like my hands are going pretty slow when I'm out here, because I'm letting the head do the work. So that's way number 1. Way number 2, if I want to thicken up that forte part of it, I can have about 3 or 4 loud strokes and then go to the soft roll. So I'm almost kind of dropping my hands like this. I'm doing like 1, 2, 3 here, and then they kind of go out to the playing area. So it's like, if you imagine like a back-to-back J and an L. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110, 111, 112, 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, 118, 119, 120, The last one I think is very useful for pops concerts, especially if you're playing with like an orchestra and you may not have an exposed part. And that is simply to have a loud strike, wait a pause, and then sneak in. I think within the context of a wind ensemble or orchestra, that's fine to do if it's not exposed. I think the problem that I have, if I was going to do that and the roll was exposed, is you hear those three different sounds. You hear the attack of the first stroke, the pause, and then the sneaking in. So again, if it's exposed, I would recommend doing way 1 or 2 where you thicken up the sound. And if it's not exposed, you can certainly do the sneaking in. Another useful technique that you'll need to have for this instrument is rolling from drum to drum to get a really connected, smooth legato sound. There's a few different ways that you can do this. One way is to think about paradiddles. So if I'm preparing to go to my right drum, I'll actually do 2 lefts at the end. And then vice versa, if I'm going from my right drum to my left drum, I can actually play that right paradiddle to prepare myself. So real slow, again, this is what it's going to look like. And then sped up. Another way you can make this happen is to think about an odd number. So if I think about 5s, for instance. That helps me prepare which hand is going from the right drum to the left drum and vice versa. So that's another one to do. And when we talk about Finlandia, that'll be one way to approach that particular excerpt. Finally, using metered rolls is really a useful thing to do. And so what I mean by metered rolls is I'm thinking of a very specific rhythm. So in this case, I'll think a sextuplet. And that's really useful if you have a short roll. So let's say in this case, we'll do a quarter note. So this is my tempo. I've got ba-da, ba-da, ba-da. So my hands are playing, but I'm trying to use my ear to adjust it so that I don't get digga-da-digga-da-da. I don't want you to hear that rhythm. I want it to be as smooth as possible. So it's kind of the effect of doing like da 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 da, and having it kind of meld together in that way. So a couple of these etudes coming up here will use that technique, and I'll explain that for each one of those. Okay. So just a few short etudes and excerpts to talk about, and then we'll open it up to the questions here at the end. So all of these etudes that I have are from the Timpani Method by Alfred Friese and Alexander Lepak, which is a wonderful book. I highly recommend getting that book and using that and possibly the Carroll book and the Goodman book as well. Each one of those books does a wonderful approach to the instrument. What I really like about the Friese Lepak are these roll etudes that they have in about the middle portion of the book that really go into some of the difficulties that you might face as a timpanist. And so the first one I'm going to look at is number 4 from these roll etudes. And this one explores a few different things. I have a loud roll that goes to soft over a pretty long period of time, 2 measures. I have a couple of forte piano rolls, and then I have a sforzando. And I think it's important when you're doing sforzandos that they sound different from forte pianos, especially if they're right next to forte pianos in the same piece of music. I think if the composer went to the trouble of writing a forte piano and a sforzando, they should sound different. And so in this case, the forte piano, I'm going to interpret that as meaning literally loud followed by literally soft. So a loud dynamic followed by a soft dynamic. Versus sforzando is going to be closer to an accent. And so in this case, it will always be contextual. So the last dynamic in this etude is forte. That means it'll be a sforzando accent within the context of forte. If I had a piano dynamic, it would be a sforzando within the context of a piano dynamic. So in other words, not too loud. Okay, so here's number 4. So let me talk real quick here. At the second line, measure 3, I've got 2 really quick forte piano rolls. Dum, bum. And so in this case, I am thinking that sextuplet thing I mentioned a little while ago. So and having it work for both of those rolls. Ding-da-dun, ding-da-da-dun. And then when I get to the sforzando, it's the accented note followed by sustaining and supporting it at that loud dynamic. Okay, so let me just play the second half here. This is starting on the second line on that forte piano whole note roll. 1, 2, 3, and. The next one is number 8. Number 8 has you rolling from drum to drum, and if you notice, there's a tremolo indication that goes over all of the notes. And so the rhythm of the first 3 measures is 2 half notes, 4 quarter notes, and a whole note. So in other words, he wants without going and re-articulating each one of those. So this is where I'm going to use that paradiddle technique that I mentioned earlier. Let's try this with some of these Herbert 5s here, see how this sounds. So as I approach this, I'm going to have very subtle double strokes to help me prepare and move to the next drum. Okay? So let's try number 8. About the same tempo. 1, 2, ready? Now this one does have another little thing that I haven't talked about, but is a really useful technique when we're talking about hairpins. One of the excerpts that comes immediately to mind is the end of Brahms 1, that famous excerpt where it goes da 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 bum. Da. There's those hairpins with the sforzando in the middle. You don't want to go overboard with this, but this is a great technique that I learned from my teacher, Mr. Rabbio, where you use less mass of the mallet. So using towards the tip, go in towards more mass of the mallet, and then go back. And so I'll be up here at the edge, just move my hands down, and automatically it adds that shading without me having to go vertically. So I have something like, and it just adds a really nice subtle shade to that hairpin. So if you have cartwheel mallets, especially something like this, and you have 2 different surface areas potentially, that's something worth checking out, especially for Brahms 1. The last Friese Lepak etude is number 10, and I call this one, the graduation etude for my students. I think it's jam-packed with everything that Friese and Lepak have been talking about with the roll etudes up to this point. There's sforzandos, there's forte pianos, there's really fast rolls. So the second measure of, the first measure of the second line, for instance, has, if I was going this tempo, it has, well, that's tough. Okay, so I've got but, and each one of those each one of those eighth notes has a roll over the top of it. So what can I do if that's the tempo and I can't get to sound clean? Well, one thing I might consider is actually dropping the mallets and kind of doing a really open roll, really open buzzed roll. So in context, that could be an effective way to approach that. I can think about at least one other time in the repertoire, Sibelius' Second Symphony, where there's a rhythm that Sibelius wrote something very similar over the top of. And that might be one way to approach it, where you just do this kind of open. To get that sort of roll texture without having to worry about the, how do I make that work? So this is etude number 10. Okay, so now I have a couple of excerpts from the repertoire I want to talk about. And these aren't necessarily technically difficult excerpts, but I do think they take a little bit of a care in terms of figuring out what sort of sound quality, how you want to shade, how you want to phrase each one of them. So the first excerpt that we're going to take a look at is from Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, and this is actually the big long roll that happens after the famous excerpt. So this is at letter U. And a couple of things I want to note that are going on at this moment in the score. It's marked triple forte, and it stays that way for 4 bars with a diminuendo. Then it goes down to forte, diminuendos all the way down to piano. And what's happening in the score at this point, for those first 4 bars, you have this really in-your-face trumpet, dun, da da dun dun dun, da 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 dun da da, ya da da ba da, followed by the horns, bum, da da dun dun dun, and the horn texture is a little more reserved. It feels and sounds a little bit more distant. And so how can I apply that to the timpani part here? One way I like to approach this is to play those first 4 bars pretty in your face. And so I'm going to intentionally do a couple of things. I'm going to use a pretty fast roll speed because it's going to give you this certain feeling when you hear a roll that fast. I'm also going to darken up the sound quite a bit because I like the idea of this dun, da da dun dun dun, da 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 dum ba dum. I like hearing that with a darker sound rather than a lighter sound. So I'm actually going to be intentionally more in this position with my hands rather than in this position. But as I approach the measure 5, when the horns take over, I will change from here to lighten up the sound and also slow down the roll speed. So I'm going to use a David Herbert number 4 for this. So again, 4 measures of pretty in your face, followed by relaxing and starting to slow down the roll speed. So we're about here. 1, ready? So hopefully you were able to hear that change in color, especially around measure 4, as I started to go from here to this more overhand approach to somewhere in here. And it started to slow up, and it changed the texture and the sound of the roll. I think it's a really, really cool way to shade that particular roll. The last excerpt that I have for you is the famous excerpt from Sibelius's Finlandia. And so in this one, we have a continuous roll over these quarter notes. Dum bum 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 bum. And how do we approach that? So one way might be to just simply do that 4-stroke thing that we did with some of those Friese etudes. That could work really, really well, and I think in context, if you were playing that live with an orchestra, that would be just wonderful. You might have a conductor that asks for those to really be slurred, and so here you can do intentionally odd numbers. So I'm going to do 5s. I'm going to do 5s the entire time, with the exception of the time the A flat is doubled. And the second one I would do is 16th notes. So in context, it would sound like this. So I think either one of those ways works really well. I'm going to go back to way A. That's the way I like to do this. But again, either one works well, and if you're going to do this for an audition in the future, I would definitely have both available in your toolbox. So here's a little bit right before that, a couple measures before that. 1, 2, 3. So let's say I did that, and I'm like, it sounds a little slappy. I don't like the sound of those mallets. Okay, so these were 2s. What if I try something a little less articulate? This would be like a David Herbert number 3, a general mallet. We'll try the same excerpt so you can hear the difference. So this is a particular excerpt where there is a trade-off. The more articulate mallets will help with those rhythms at F, but the less articulate mallets will help with the rolls. And so it's finding that balance and how do you use your ear to adjust for a more articulate sound versus that warm legato sound that you need for rolls. And so again, I want to thank the Percussive Arts Society and particularly the PAS Education Committee for having me here to talk to you all. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'd also like to thank my sponsors, the University of Memphis, Grover Pro Percussion, JG Percussion, Remo, Yamaha, and Zildjian. Thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your virtual PASIC.